Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. At the time of the first Trump presidency, EdCast examined his possible impact on education in a show we called What's the Worst That Could Happen? It seemed then there was quite a lot. Trump's second term in office promises even greater changes to the educational landscape. His own rhetoric and the Project 2025 Guide to the Republican Agenda suggest several policy changes that will affect students, teachers, and families in profound ways. Today, EdCast speaks with an education policy expert to make sense of these proposals and what they augur for education in the years ahead. Coming up now on EdCast. Joining me today is Halley Potter. She is a senior fellow and director of pre-K through 12 education policy at the Century Foundation, where she works to advance public policy solutions for addressing educational inequality. She is an expert on school integration, preschool equity, charter schools, and college access. Halley is co-author with Richard D. Kallenberg of A Smarter Charter, Finding What Works for Charter Schools and Public Education. She has been published in numerous news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, U.S. News, and Educational Leadership, and she has appeared on MSNBC and public radio. She has testified before lawmakers and provided technical assistance and research to school superintendents, principals, school board members, and teachers across the country. In 2014, Halley Potter co-founded the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition to support racially and economically integrated public charter schools. She graduated from Yale University and is an alumnus of the Coro Leadership New York program. Thank you so much for joining us today on EdCast, Halley. It's so good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Linda.
As you know, President-elect Trump has said that he intends to make significant changes to education in his next term, and he's laid out a number of policy changes that I think we want to talk about and go through them and what the implications are. But I want to ask you from the top, do you think President Trump is interested in education?
I think education's best hope over the next 4 years might be that it's a low priority for President Trump. And one of the indications that we have early on coming that supports that is his proposed nominee for Secretary of Education. Linda McMahon does not have deep experience in education. This is not bringing someone with expertise or even with a clear agenda. If Trump really wanted to make education a priority, I would expect to see a different pick, a different history there. And one of the other things that makes me think, perhaps it's just lower on the priority list is that he really hasn't provided in his campaign materials a lot of specificity around what he would do in education.
Certainly about how children learn. I mean, there's been nothing about that. All right, so there are any number of proposed changes that we are going to talk about, but is there one that jumps out to you as the most problematic or the one that you're concerned about the most?
Well, the one that, I've been thinking about and that's gotten a lot of attention is President Trump's promise to close the U.S. Department of Education.
Okay, let's talk about that. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start. He's not the first person to propose this. We have had other Republican presidents promise to make this change. In terms of what it would actually take practically to close the Department of Education, there's a good chance it won't happen just because it takes an act of Congress. It would require overriding the filibuster. It would be really challenging. But symbolically, I think it's a statement from Trump that is about trying to dramatically roll back the federal role that that the government is playing in education in terms of supporting schools and also in terms of the ways that the federal government can outline certain protections for students.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those things because they are crucial, because even if he cannot dismantle the Department of Education, he still is capable of making any number of changes. So what are some of those changes that you think will have an effect that we might be concerned about? You mentioned supports for students. Let's talk about Funding, let's talk about those.
Yeah, so civil rights enforcement is a big one that can change a lot from administration to administration because a lot can be done administratively in terms of how the Department of Education and the Department of Justice decide to enforce different rules. One of the early moves that we expect to come from the Trump administration is to roll back the Title IX rule that President Biden put in place to affirm supports for transgender students and for LGBTQ plus students more generally. Under a Trump administration, not only could that rule be rescinded, and in fact we expect that that would happen, but enforcement around civil rights in general could look very different. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights very likely could focus on targeting schools where there are protections for transgender students, using a flipped argument to say that, claiming that those schools are infringing the rights of cisgender students by allowing, trans students to have access to bathrooms that align with their gender, for example. So those types of decisions in terms of what cases to prioritize and whether to respond to complaints. The Office for Civil Rights gets complaints about racial discrimination, about discrimination for students with disabilities, and if the office decides not to act on those complaints, then those students and their families lose out on a critical line of response to ensure that their educational rights are upheld.
So they should be concerned.
Yes.
Okay, now let's talk about funding. I think here's where funding is a really big deal. And so let's talk about it. So even if they're still a shell of a Department of Education, and I call it maybe just a shell, a name, but what are some of the Trump proposals in terms of funding schools and giving money?
One of the big shifts, the big theme of the shift that we would expect to see is decreasing federal support for education and trying to find ways to funnel some of that money that has been going to public schools into private choice options. That could look like coming up with different tax schemes that can allow contributions or individual participation in voucher-like programs for families to send their children to private schools. It could mean looking at cuts in big federal programs like Title I funding for schools. Some of these things have bipartisan support. They're going to schools across the country, so we'd hope that that would temper some of the cuts. But Trump has sent a pretty clear message that he doesn't want to be investing in schools in a big way at a federal level, and so I think we expect to see those cuts.
Let me play the devil's advocate kind of. I'm a parent and I'm listening. I'm thinking, I like choice. What's so terrible about giving me a voucher? I don't really care for the public school around the corner, and I would like to have a voucher. And what's so bad about that? Why are educators concerned about this kind of a funding formula?
Yeah, choice and empowering parents are incredibly valuable principles, and ones that we shouldn't let only be associated with conservative values and private school vouchers. One of the problems with private school vouchers is that they only empower parents who already have certain supports in place. Under many voucher programs, you get money to support private school tuition. It might not support all of the tuition. If you're a more affluent family that can fill in the gap, that helps your bottom line and you can still make it happen. If you're coming from a truly disadvantaged background, that voucher might not be enough to make it happen. Or if it gets you into a school, but you don't have civil rights protections in place in that school, or if you have a child with disabilities, a private school voucher is not necessarily likely to get you the services that you need, because many of those private schools don't provide the access to services that students need in their individualized education plans. So it combines an uneven playing field that advantages the already advantages families with removing the protections and supports that are so essential in public schools.
Now, have there been also proposals to give money to religious schools as well, to allow these vouchers to go for religious schools.
Yes, and there are active cases in the states. This is a crucial, another civil rights protection area. One of the things that it could be really damaging about having more of our public money funneled into private school vouchers is sending money to religious schools where there's not equitable access, where there is then public support for a particular religious dogma, and where in certain schools there are also different types of discrimination that go along with that. There are some religious schools that explicitly do not allow LGBTQ students to enroll, for example. And the idea of having public money go to those schools, to me, is against everything that we should be standing up for in terms of broadening access and broadening support.
To me, it sounds like a violation of the separation between church and state on the most minimal level, but people seem to be going along with lots of things. Even I read in Texas teaching the Bible in public schools, so these are all interesting things that are coming down. Yeah. Let's go back to our littlest ones and Head Start. So there have been threats to Head Start. What do we know might we be looking at in terms of Head Start funding, and why are we worried?
Yeah, so Head Start is one of the programs that has been targeted, first of all, under Project 2025, which is an agenda put together by the Heritage Foundation, Conservative Foundation, and it's coupled with other statements in this vision that really pull away support for public early education, that are focusing instead on really only trying to have children at home with parents and families, which can be a great choice, and there's nothing wrong with finding ways to support that, but we have decades of evidence on the benefits
of early
education.
You. What is the evidence that we have about the benefits of early education?
Investing in early education is one of the best public investments we can make. There are 7 to 10-fold increases on our returns on investment that can come from every dollar you spend on a young child to their later economic success and the value that they can bring to us as a country. And we just know that that is one of the most critical times of brain development in the years 0 to 5. That also coincides with a time when young families are often in their most economically vulnerable and stretched states. And the only way we really make this work for kids and for their families is to have big public investments. Head Start has been doing this for decades with an incredibly strong track record. And yet there is this call now, potentially to abolish Head Start, which would be really devastating. It would be devastating across the country. It would be devastating in New York City, where almost 20,000 children are in Head Start programs.
So we have that many students. Now, it's interesting, though, because people do tend to think of Head Start money as going to minorities in the inner city. But a lot of Head Start money does not go to the inner city. Where does a lot of it go to?
A lot of Head Start money goes in rural areas, and a lot of that is rural, white areas of the country. And in fact, those are the places I think that would stand to be hardest hit. In somewhere like New York City, we have Head Start. We also have city funding that's coming in. We have universal pre-K set up. There are many places in rural areas where Head Start is the public early ed option, and to take that away would truly be devastating for those families and communities.
So are there any other, I wanted to ask you some assessment issues, but before we get to that, are there any other proposals that have been made either through Project 2025 or the president and his spokespeople that you are also worried about or that you think we should pay attention to?
Well, one of the other big areas that I think should be on everybody's radar is thinking about immigration.
Okay,
and
let's talk about immigration.
The ways that is going to affect schools.
How will that affect schools?
So Trump has promised mass deportations. That could have huge effects in schools at multiple levels. first for students who themselves are undocumented, or for students whose parents are undocumented. We're talking about either having students ripped out of their schools or separated from their families. And then there are also students whose parents may be here under different types of visas, but visa rule changes could change. So it could be incredibly destabilizing for those individual students and their families. And then moving up a level, what that means for schools is educators who are trying to support these students and their families and to keep a school community together are now put in this place where they have to figure out how to do that. Luckily, there are some things that school districts can do to set up good policies, for example, to make sure that folks who are working in schools know how to respond if ICE shows up at the school door, to know that they don't have to open the door, that they can send things to a central office and make sure that folks are properly vetting and only if there is a proper warrant. So there are some things that schools can do to prepare for this. But it's also just a sad state to think that that's what school administrators now need to be spending some of their energy on, instead of really just focusing on making sure that these kids are getting the access and the educational needs met.
Do we have any legal obligation to support students no matter who they are?
Absolutely.
I thought we did. I mean,
we do. Okay. We do. Yeah. The Supreme Court case Plyler versus Doe established that regardless of a student's immigration status, they have a right to education in this country. That's an incredibly important principle.
This would be a violation of that. I mean, right? A moral and a legal violation.
It absolutely would, and it's one of the ways in which these policy areas really just collide.
Now, I'm going to get to Mr. Trump's favorite enemy, the woke person, the woke school. Very bad to have, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just to be woke. But that might also impinge on how we teach, right? I mean, how we teach American history, which we've talked about on this show, by the way, many times. But is it possible to take funding away from schools based on what they teach or don't teach, or if they have diversity and inclusion activities?
I think the Trump administration likely will try to add certain strings to federal funding that could try to take away those funds. We saw some of this in the last Trump administration, and sometimes states and districts were able successfully to push back. But it's a real threat that's out there. And it's one of those ways, again, that, the Office for Civil Rights, for example, could be turned into a machine that's really about trying to find examples. And the most likely way, I think, that this could happen is finding a few examples to really, to make scapegoats. And the chilling effect that could have is also worrisome. That we might see places that are pulling back on these initiatives because they don't want to get that kind of attention, and they don't want their funding for different programs to be stripped.
I know he's made the word woke sound so loaded. Can you tell us what we mean by being woke? It's not such a big thing, being aware.
I mean, I think it's part of critical education, raising students to be members of a diverse society, to understand different perspectives. That requires educators who can give them different lenses on history and on looking at what's happening in society today. And it's really unfortunate that that basis for having good civil discourse and raising students who are going to be productive members of society has somehow turned into something that's highly charged and partisan.
Now, I did read that Project 2025 recommends that the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the Nation's Report Card, the NAEP, include family structure in addition to race and socioeconomic status. Why would they want to include family structure, and what might be the impact of that?
On its face, more data isn't necessarily bad, but this is likely tied to an agenda about having particular ideas of traditional family structures, thinking about only looking at heterosexual couples, looking at families that have a two-parent family household. That's not the case for many, many children in this country. And yet, when we talked about Head Start, some of the pushback there is again coming from some rhetoric that's focused on a very narrow and I'd say archaic limiting definition of really seeing a vision for children being at home with a parent, and let's be honest, probably with a mother, right, and pulling away support for public education. And so I think, some of the language around parental rights is really a cloak for something that is much more specific and limiting, and not really about every parent's right, but about a very specific idea of, what a family can and should be.
Now, higher ed also faces some threats, many threats, but I don't know if we have time to even go into the threats that higher ed is facing. But if I had a student loan, I'd have to accept that I better pay it off, but, aside from many other things. But in terms of all these proposals, we are running out of time. Which are the ones that look, we're not prognosticators. We don't know what's going to happen. We never know. But if you had to make a guess, which are some of the things that you think might be happening under a Trump administration in terms of education?
I think the civil rights enforcement issues are probably going to be the first one, because a lot of that stuff can be done administratively.
Okay.
You don't need Congress. Day one of the administration, the U.S. Department of Education can rescind important guidance that has been protecting students, can totally change the strategy of what sort of cases they're prioritizing. So to me, I think that's the first thing that we'll see. And then funding cuts as we prepare for the next budget is definitely going to be
so
something
funding
that we
cuts
worry
also
about.
Could you just tell people again, what is a block grant? So if we've done, what does that mean?
A block grant means that the money is going to states for states to then divide up on their own.
So they don't have to give the money necessarily to education if they don't want to, and they can determine how much on their own.
Correct.
Okay, so anything that people can do, parents, children can do to protect themselves, particularly in terms of the rollback of civil rights for students? Is there anything anyone can do, or people putting things into place now maybe? Is there anything they can do?
Well, like I mentioned around immigration, there are specific things that districts can do. Same things around thinking about what are the local school district and state policies to support vulnerable student groups, making sure that those policies are in place, knowing that the federal policies might well change, and also, anticipating that there could be negative attention coming from the federal government for having some of these policies in place, and already, being ready to push back against that. As I said, there were examples in the previous Trump administration where they tried to pull away funding from certain programs, saying, your state has a policy in place that, allows transgender students to compete in sports, and, we see that as a civil rights violation. But states were successful in pushing back. So I think it's important for there not to be that chilling effect, and for our local and state leaders to do everything they can to have the right protections in place at that level.
You are so informative and well informed. I'm going to ask you one quick question in a minute that we have left. If you were the head of the Department of Education, Halley Potter, what would you want to see done for education in the coming term?
I think we should see a bigger role for the federal government in education, really the exact opposite of what Trump is calling for. Because the federal government can really set the tone for education across the country. Education is largely run by states, and it's happening in individual school districts, but the federal government could play an incredibly important role in helping to even out some of the inequities, to provide the funding for the states that have less, for the student groups that need more, and to then create these opportunities to uplift the particular types of learning that we know really benefit students, to create more programs like the Federal Magnet Schools program, and really invest in that type of innovation.
Oh, thank you so much, Halley Potter of the Century Foundation. You've given us a glimpse of what might be coming and what the effects will be. So I thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you on EdCast. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. While black students overall continue to face disproportionate punishment, such as suspensions, black girls bear the brunt of discipline in school. Black female students are penalized more frequently than other girls, accounting for almost 50% of suspensions. Contributing factors include stereotypes and more severe punishments for black girls than for peers with similar offenses. AI seems everywhere, and educators are exploring its teaching and learning potential. But caution is in order. The Hechinger report notes a University of Pennsylvania study in which Turkish students using ChatGPT for math practice performed worse on a test than students who practiced without it. The authors observed that over-reliance on AI tools might actually reduce learning. How much bullying is really going on in school? According to students, a lot. In a newly released 2024 school survey, more New York City students than at any point in the past 5 years say kids in their schools regularly bully each other. More than half of the roughly 355,000 middle and high school student respondents said their classmates sometimes or often bullied or intimidated each other in the last school year. Do your teens seem older recently? Their brains might be. The New York Times reports on a University of Washington study that found that pandemic-related lockdowns accelerated brain aging in teens, particularly in girls, by up to 4 years. Adding to concerns about the pandemic's long-term mental health effects, the study found premature thinning of the cerebral cortex, which is linked to increased anxiety, depression, and behavioral issues. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your thoughts and comments to cunyedcast@gmail.com.